True to their design ethos, Vaxi don't waste any money on flashy boxes or pack-ins. You pay for a mouse, you get a mouse. That's about it. As a consequence, the mouse price is fairly reasonable at $65 in the US and €70 in the EU. The MP01S is available in white gloss and black matte coating. This only changes the main shell, as the buttons will always have a textured satin feel regardless of which you opt for. A consistent theme in this review is going to be all killer, no filler. There's no RGB, no holes, no aggressive comfort grooves or flared triggers, and I can't say that this mouse is any worse for it. It sports a throwback nostalgic charm that differentiates it from its flashier counterparts. The MP01S build is incredibly sturdy with absolutely no flex or creak. The single piece moulded shell also removes joints that might potentially limit grip options and flexibility. Whilst it's technically an asymmetrical shape, this mouse feels far closer to an ambidextrous than an ergonomic in hand. I knew that this was going to be a small mouse, but what surprised me was how low and flat it was. The hump profile is a subtle rear bias, kinda close to the Viper Ultima or Final Mouse Small, as opposed to something more central and pronounced like the G Pro X Superlight. Whilst I use a fingertip grip, the shape and subtle back left ergonomic consideration made this mouse a very good option for claw grip users. The buttons lacking any comfort grooves was a little off-putting at first, as most other mice I use have some level of contour or deviation. But the more I used it, I started to realise that I think they've kept the curve off of mouse 1 and 2 to provide more grip flexibility, and it didn't take too long for me to adapt. The side buttons are easy to find and do protrude from the shell, but they are a little bit smaller than you typically see in a mouse of this size. The mouse uses a Pixart 3389 sensor, so absolutely no issues with its performance, but it can have tracking issues on some surfaces. Through my testing, I noticed cursor irregularity and porting on the Tiger Esports Lingyung, with complete spinouts on the Artisan Raiden. This isn't so much a critique of the mouse, but rather a nuance of the 3389, so be aware if you main either of these surfaces, you're unlikely to find this mouse very viable. Vaxi don't provide any software, and all customization is done with simple, intuitive buttons on the base of the mouse. DPI, polling rate, and debounce are adjusted with a single button cycle for each. Initially, I had thought that it lacked lift-off distance customization, but was made aware on their site that you can cycle through 3 settings with a particular button combination. It is a bit disappointing that on a plug-and-play mouse, all of the features and functionality aren't clearly printed either in a user manual or on the side of the box for reference. Whilst I'm not typically a fan of gloss mice, the texture on the sides acted almost as a pseudo grip tape, keeping my thumb and fingers locked in position on the sides. The click feel overall is exceptional. Vaxi opted to use Huano 60g switches, which gives them a distinctive feel as opposed to the Omron 20M or KLGM 8.0s we seem to almost universally see from other manufacturers. Here's what the Huano 60g sound like compared to some other mice using more common switches. The scroll wheel feels quite unique using a 24-step optical system, which results in one of the most precise and defined wheels that I've ever used. Conversely, it's also the noisiest and possibly most distracting, especially for general web browsing and page scrolling. Now, whilst mechanically it performs perfectly, and if you use headphones at your desk, it might not impact you, if you work in a shared space, it could well be an irritant to those around you, so be mindful. Here's what it sounds like compared to some other popular mice. The skates are about as good as you could ask for, with large rounded surfaces inspired by Zowie mice and gliding consistently across cloth, hybrid and glass surfaces with no noticeable weak points or resistances. In terms of the cord, just like the scroll wheel, this is a divisive and intentional decision to have a stiffer cord with an upward angled stress relief. It's almost designed to be used with a bungee to get the most out of it. Loose on the pad, you absolutely feel some resistance, making the mouse feel quite front heavy. But once it's in a bungee, it's much more discreet and doesn't interfere at all with play. I was initially skeptical that I'd like this mouse. It's heavier than I'm used to, has a stiff cable, and isn't the traditional ambidextrous shape that I gravitate to. But the MP01S was an absolute joy to use. The shape quickly felt natural, and I found the mouse encouraged me to drift into a more relaxed claw from my traditional fingertip grip, which gave me much more stability, which I especially felt in my tracking. The heavier weight was also much less of a detrimental factor than I thought it would end up being. At 71 grams plus cable, the mouse is almost twice the weight of some of my other regular mains. I didn't find that I was any slower to flick to targets, in all honesty. I tested the mouse across several surfaces and found that I performed best on my Artisan Zero Extra Soft, which helped to retain control without adding too much resistance. A SteelSeries QCK or Corsair MM mousepad would provide a comparable experience for a much more reasonable asking price. So to summarise my thoughts, starting with the pros, the mouse's build quality is exceptional. It is one of the handful of mice that I've bought that came complete out the box, ready to use, no modifications, no aftermarket parts, no software tweaks needed, it just worked. It's also affordable. Now, I haven't mentioned price much in this review, but at $65, the build quality punches far above its weight, and if I were to compare it to some other OEM products of a similar cost, it's night and day in terms of build quality, specs, and what's on offer with Vaxi. You can feel the esports pedigree here. If you're a serious competitor, Vaxi are absolutely a viable pick for your main. And the shape is flexible. With how versatile the grip options are, I think the MP01S is a safe pick to accommodate a variety of hand sizes and grip styles. Now, some of the areas that I think Vaxi could change to improve their product, first and foremost, a user guide. I appreciate they're delivering a plug and play experience, but I think a more comprehensive guide for things like lift-off distance cycling and what the DPI steps are would be appreciated. Alternatively, to reduce the carbon footprint and paper waste, they could go with a discrete QR code linking to a digital version. I think a bit more flexibility in colour would be appreciated. It's a shame that to get a white mouse you have to select the gloss option. I appreciate this is cosmetic, but black and white variants of the mouse, both in matte and gloss, will give a little more flexibility without, I think, compromising on the Vaxi vision of simplicity. Next, I think some add-ins in the box. Now, whilst I appreciate this may be a cost save to bring down MSRP by a few dollars, including the alternative skate thickness in the box as spares be a nice gesture considering just how sparse that unboxing experience is otherwise. Next, the cord. I actually didn't mind it once it was in a bungee, but I appreciate that it is thicker and more rigid than some of the other mice that I've used, and other people may have an issue with this. Again, your mileage may vary, but even Zowie, who arguably have a similar target audience, have opted for a more flexible, soft cable on the C-Series revision of their mice. Lastly, I think there's scope for some sensor options. Whilst the 3380 is absolutely top tier, the tracking issues that I mentioned on certain surfaces make it an unsafe pick or recommendation for any pad, especially if you intend to play at tournaments where they may not let you use your own. I think offering a 3360 variant, or even shifting back to the 3360 entirely, would potentially overcome this without detrimentally impacting the competitive edge of this mouse. I think the best way to summarise my experience with the MP01S and how I'd best position the competitive difference that Vaxi have is the concept of a product floor versus a product ceiling. Whilst other brands are pushing the product ceiling of what's possible with mice under 40 grams, optical switches, less than 1 millisecond wireless tech, their attention is not conversely focused on their product floor, the potential worst case scenario or build variability in their products. Vaxi instead have set a product ceiling where they feel is suitable for competitive esports, and instead of trying to push that, have gone to town on increasing that product floor, raising the average above that of the competition, and ensuring that every mouse that they ship is delivered with consistently excellent build quality. This is particularly relevant for esports pros that often have to bring multiple copies of sealed, unmodded mice to competitions in order to use them. How much do you trust your favourite mouse brand to deliver a flawless copy when potentially a $100,000 final might be on the line? There is a reason that so many pros put their trust in Zowie and now Vaxi when it comes to delivering that reliable, dependable tool for them to compete with. Vaxi themselves have said they don't intend to give you the lightest, fastest or flashiest mice, but what they can be trusted to do is always deliver exactly what you expect, and for competitive minded players, the guarantee of quality is arguably better than the variable of potential excellence.